In the Antarctic, on the ice slope, there is a modest American research base. Paleoclimatologist Jack Hall, along with a small team, is engaged in important work. They are drilling centuries-old ice strata to reveal the riddles of nature. However, their drilling leads to a funny effect. Reminiscent of what the squirrel with a nut in the Ice Age has done, the ice train cracks, forming a multi-kilometer crack directly across the base. Scientists come to the conclusion that this is not their drilling caused a crack, but global warming, which leads to melting an ice hat at the South Pole. To confirm his assumptions, Jack needs to collect data, and he has to jump through the gap formed. Later, he appears at the UN conference in Delhi, where he warns world leaders about the impending threat of global warming and a possible ice age. However, leaders do not take this seriously, believing that an economy that can collapse at any time is more important than blurring forecasts without specific dates and consequences. After the performance, Jack meets Professor Terry Rapson, the head of the laboratory in Scotland who also studies the problem of global warming. Meanwhile, while people are busy with political debate, the weather begins to deteriorate. In Delhi, the capital of India, there is wet snow, a phenomenon that is extremely unusual for this region. A huge hail falls out in Tokyo. Climate buoys fix a sharp drop in temperature first off the coast of the Antarctic, and then in different parts of the oceans, where a warm current took place. These data are entered in the laboratory of Professor Rapson. Returning from Delhi to Washington, Jack Hall finds out that his son Sam failed an exam in mathematics despite his outstanding abilities in the exact sciences. The ex-wife asks Jack to take his son to the airport the next day so that he can participate in a quiz in New York and chat with his father, who is constantly on expeditions. Jack agrees, but almost late, earning at work. He literally pulls his son out of the paws of a taxi driver. Sam's plane falls into a huge thunderstorm cloud and strong turbulence begins. At this time, astronauts from the side of the space station observe the formation of huge cyclones in the atmosphere of the Earth. Nevertheless, the student successfully arrives in New York, where the streets are filled with car traffic jams. Walking, Sam notices how huge flocks of birds migrate in the sky. Professor Rapson, having analyzed the data from the ocean hunkers, calls Jack to report the impending cataclysm. The cyclone moving from Japan reaches the western coast of the United States. Los Angeles becomes the first city to strike the elements. The somewhat rapidly formed tornado unite into a giant Superman, which practically blows the city center. Reporters lead direct reports from the scene, risking their lives. The helicopter shows how the tornado crushes the famous inscription Hollywood and leaves the ruin strip. Scientists in Washington are going to an emergency conference. They know about the three epicenters of abnormal natural phenomena: above Canada, an Arctic cyclone; in Siberia, the area of phenomenally low pressure and a record-powered powerful typhoon collapsed to Australia. Scientists suggest that these phenomena can be interconnected. It was previously believed that the only force that could so globally affect the weather was the sun, but flashes on it were not recorded. Jack suggests that the cause of the anomalies could be the North Atlantic course, and taking into account the data of Professor Rapson, this seems the only logical explanation. The displacement of the ocean current causes violations of cold and warm airflows. If so, the anomalies will continue and intensify, which will lead to global climatic changes. Sam and his team successfully perform at intellectual competitions, but due to bad weather, all flights are canceled. The guys decide to return home by train, which Sam tells his father on the phone. However, moving around New York is difficult due to traffic jams and rainfalls. The streets are flooded, and the sewage system cannot cope with the flow of water. The guys will have to stay for the night with friends. The Hall team plans to simulate the further development of events, and the results are extremely depressing. The weather will be seriously intensified, and the climate will change in the next 6 to 8 weeks. With new data, Jack goes to the vice president, hoping to convince him to begin the mass evacuation of citizens. However, the politician does not want to listen to him. At this time, a cold cyclone is being formed over Europe and Britain. The troops evacuate residents and the royal family. 3 helicopters of the air forces are trying to get to the center of the cyclone, but this leads to catastrophic consequences. Due to low temperatures, fuel freezes, and helicopters suffer. Those who survive with hard landing freeze to death like T-1000 in a puddle of liquid nitrogen. Sam and his comrades are watching news on TV about how a sharply rising ocean level flows the coast of Canada. School children are trying to get to the station, but the streets of the city are already knee-deep are flooded with water, and the rain does not stop. The roads are clogged with abandoned cars. They get to the public library when a giant tidal wave rolls on New York. First, she floods the island of Freedom along with the Statue of Freedom, and then covers the whole city. Young people barely manage to hide on the upper floors of the library with those few who were nearby and managed to run away. Jack and his team analyzed new data and realized that they were mistaken in forecasts. Instead of 8 weeks weeks in front, 3 supersogons with extremely low temperatures that will change the climate are waiting for them. One at Britain, the second over Siberia, and the third moves from Canada to the USA. Professor Rapson realizes that with his assistance, he will not be able to get out of his station and asks Jack to take care of those who can still be saved. A professor with colleagues drink a bottle of tape while the generator produces the last drops of fuel. In the flooded New York, survivors in the library are hiding under a warm blanket. Sam finds a working phone on the lower floor and informs his father about his whereabouts. Paul Sr. warns his son about the approaching bad weather. To survive, you cannot go outside. You need to stay in a closed room and burn everything that is possible to warm up. The main thing is to hold out until he comes to save them. Arriving water floods the lower tier and interrupts the conversation. Outside the window, a Russian ship floats, which stuck between the buildings. The first snow breaks down from heaven. Jack plans to go to his son to another city and needs equipment for polar expeditions. Before leaving, scientists ask him to personally report to the president about the situation and give recommendations. They are simple. Try to evacuate everyone who is south of a certain meridian to the southern states or even to Mexico. Those who north are almost doomed to death from a super cyclone with an insignificant probability of survival. After a hurricane, the northern lands will be under snow and ice, which will become the beginning of a new ice age. The president gives an order to start evacuation, and Hall himself sets off with 2 trusted colleagues. The Public Library of New York, where the survivors took refuge, noticed the snow. All water on the street turns into ice. The survivors leave the city, trying to go away. Sam, remembering the forecast of his father, is trying to persuade people to stay in the library, but most believe that he can get to the southern states on foot. The evacuation, as her relatives told one girl on a cell phone, goes there. Almost everyone leaves, leaving several school children and a couple of librarians in an empty building. They collect books to burn them and save heat for a long time to wait out the storm. One of the students repairs the radio and catches the gear. The military blocks the borders with Mexico, but huge crowds of desperate people cross the river on the highway, throwing their things on the highway. School children understand that rescuers are not up to them now, and they are left to themselves. But Sam believes that his father will not leave him. The father of the senior hall overcomes the bad weather on the Pickupa until he rests on an insurmountable jail on the road. A further journey will have to continue on foot, like hobbits to Arduin, overcoming difficulties. However, the flood and the snow burn change the landscape. The polar explorers do not know that they go along the glass roof of a snowy shopping center. The glass is not withstanding the severity of loaded sledges and fails, dragging along with a sled and a rope of people. You have to trim the sled and throw it almost immediately, otherwise the next weight will drag everyone along. While Jack is trying to gain a foothold on the surface with an ice axe to pull out his failed colleague, he notes that the frozen glass roof is already cracking. The man cuts the rope, sacrificing himself so that others are not injured. In Washington, the latter evacuate the president. However, in the refugee camp in Mexico, the vice president reports that the first-person motorcade disappeared in the storm. According to the protocol, after the death of the head of state, his duties go to vice president. In the library, Sam notes that his classmate, to whom he is not indifferent, does not come to his senses after sleep. Thanks to one of the books, the survivors manage to establish the cause of her condition. The girl has blood infection caused by a scratch received several days ago. Antibiotics are needed for her salvation. Sam dares to go for medicines for a Russian ship frozen outside the window. He makes homemade snowshoes. His 2 friends decide to go with him. Teenagers penetrate the ship where they begin to look for medicines. Having discovered a first aid kit, they collect everything they can and then go to the kitchen to replenish canned food reserves. At this moment, a flock of wolves appears, escaping from the local zoo. Predators pursue school children along narrow corridors, but they manage to lock animals in one of the cabins. Returning to the library, they have time before the start of a sharp cooling. Jack Hall drags a partner who has lost his consciousness on himself when the center of Super Cyclone is approaching them. Outwardly, this manifests itself in a sharp clarification. The sky is cleaned of clouds. The snow stops. At the same time, a stream of very cold air rushes from the upper layers of the atmosphere to the ground. High-rise buildings are covered with frost, and the glasses in the skyscrapers freeze and burst from a sharp cooling. Even the flag, which is fluttering sluggishly, freezes through and through a couple of seconds. Seeing this, Jack, along with an insensitive partner, climbs into the ventilation pipe of the nearest building to wait out the storm. The next day, polar explorers continue their way and stumble on dozens of frozen bodies. Everyone who tried to leave the city died from the cold. During the halt, the partner asks Hall what will happen to civilization after such a climatic shift. The scientist responds optimistic. Humanity has survived the past ice age and will cope with this. Cosmonauts from the ISS board confirm that the super cyclone has come to naught. The cloudiness has disappeared, and for the first time since the spontaneous crisis from the orbit, the surface of the planet is visible. Jack and his assistant get to Manhattan. The weather, although terribly cold, cleared up. The sky cleared, the snow stopped, visibility improved, the deserted landscape is decorated with the islands of ships frozen in the ice, and an icy statue of freedom. The polar explorers find a library brought on the very roof, frozen through and without visible visible traces of a person's presence. But in the hall with the fireplace, few survivors are sitting. Sam, his classmates, and librarians. The former vice president and now the acting president appeals on television to the nation from the American Embassy in Mexico. He thanks citizens for the courage and country of the Third World for generosity. He then reports that there are also survivors in the northern latitudes. Rescuers received a signal from Jack Hall and sent helicopters behind him. The pilots who arrived in New York notices that, in addition to the group from the library, there are still many survivors. Those who hid in houses welcome rescuers from the roofs of skyscrapers. Jack Hall, along with his son and his friends, casts a last look at the New York snow-covered helicopter. I also advise you to watch other videos on my channel. Good luck!